Hey guys, so today is story time. We're going to be talking a little bit about the critics and supporters of the New Deal today, and we're going to be doing that by telling the story of Goldilocks and the New Deal. Okay, so when Goldilocks, or Franklin Roosevelt, the American people, had first encountered the New Deal, there are people who, much like Goldilocks, felt that some parts of it did too much, some parts of it too little, and some parts of it were just right. So we're going to look at that today. So first of all, we have that the New Deal did too much. These are going to be primarily conservatives, and basically what their argument is that FDR is making the government much too powerful. What he's doing is using the New Deal to socialize the economy and business. And remember, socialism is not something that we really want. And socialism is the control of the government, of organizations, that would normally be privately controlled. And the idea is that that is not the free market. A lot of conservatives really saw this as a threat to individual freedom, particularly some men like Robert Taft. Robert Taft was the nephew of William Howard Taft. He was very well known in his time, and he believed that the New Deal threatened individual freedoms. Herbert Hoover actually wrote a book while FDR was president, and he called the New Deal the most stupendous invasion of the whole spirit of liberty in U.S. history. So basically that Roosevelt was overstepping his bounds as president. He was doing too much, more than he should be doing, taking away the spirit of what it meant to be an American. So this is the too much. Like, the New Deal went out of control. And a lot of these guys are arguing that the New Deal wasn't doing anything. And really, when you look at the economics of it, the New Deal didn't make a whole lot of a difference on the economy itself. It's going to be in the way that the Americans feel about the economy that the New Deal really changes. But they're saying, why are you spending billions of dollars, putting America in debt? You're spending more money than we have, and you're not really solving anything. Right? So that's kind of the main argument here. The next group that we have are the liberals. And the liberals are saying, you're actually not doing enough. You're doing too little. And the liberals believed that government should be socializing more, because it's only when the government socializes that we can eliminate these social and economic inequalities. So I'm going to be talking about three specific people who were liberal critics of the New Deal. So you need to add these onto your chart with the rest of those. So the first guy that we have is a guy named Charles COUGHLIN. He was a Catholic priest. He had his own radio show. And the first thing you need to know about him is that he used to support Roosevelt at the beginning. He said things like, "Roosevelt or ruin. The New Deal is Christ's deal. If Congress fails to back up a plan by the president and his monetary program, I predict a revolution in this country that will make the French Revolution look silly. God is directing President Roosevelt." Except as the New Deal progressed, he changed his view a little bit. He basically says, wait, you started out okay, but then you kind of stopped. So he forms the National Union for Social Justice. The point of this is financial reform. This is where it starts to get a little radical here. He wants the government to guarantee an income, like saying everybody in the country is guaranteed to have X amount of money, right? The way that you do this is by wealth redistribution. So this is taking money from people who have it and giving it to people who don't, right? Can you see why that would be really controversial? This is borderline communism, actually. The last thing he thinks is that the government should nationalize the banks, or this is socialization of the banks, where the government, it goes from private ownership to government ownership of the banks. So right now, banks are owned by private citizens. He says, no, the government should be the one in control of banks, because that means that they're going to be in the one control of all the money supply, people's, income and that sort of thing. So he says this quote, we maintain the principle that there can be no lasting prosperity if free competition exists in industry. So basically, he's just trying to get rid of the free market altogether. And you can see where this would be really radical for some people who really believe in this idea of capitalism and the American economy. So that's a big part of this. The next guy we have is a guy named Dr. Francis Townsend. And where he is critical of Roosevelt is his plan of the elderly. So he comes in before the Social Security Administration is passed. And what he says is that what the government should do is for people over a certain age, 60 plus in this case, that you should be able to guarantee them $200 a month from the national sales tax. So when you buy goods and there's a sales tax attached to it, that money should go towards giving a pension for the elderly, $200 a month. The catch is that those people should spend that money within 30 days. And if they lose it, it goes back into the pot, basically. This gets overwhelming support from the people. This is a new idea, something that had never really been thought of before. And FDR actually takes this idea, and it's what he bases the Social Security Act on, because that's essentially what the Social Security Act does, except instead of the sales tax, it comes out of your income tax. However, the SSA guaranteed a little bit less than the money that Townsend thought it should be. It was less than $200 a month. And Townsend really thinks that, okay, great step, but still not enough, right? He's still pretty critical. The last guy is the man that Franklin Roosevelt called the most dangerous man in our country, Huey Long. So Huey Long was from Louisiana. He was a politician, very, very charismatic, right? He would say things like, every man is a king, and we should be sharing the wealth. He believes in wealth redistribution, okay? He opposed the Federal Reserve. He said that every family in the country should be guaranteed $5,000 a year for their household income, okay? So this is your annual income, and that was a good sum then. It's middle class. And he would go on these big speeches, and people were just attracted to him because of the way he spoke. And people just kind of bought into it. If he had been elected president, he's probably the closest we could have ever come to a dictator. A lot of people compare a lot of the things he was doing with what Adolf Hitler was doing. Obviously not the racial part of it, but the things that Hitler was talking about with the economy was a lot of what Huey Long was talking about. He does join up with Coughlin and Townsend. They form the Union Party. The hope is that Huey Long is going to run for president and be elected in the 1936 election. However, a lot of people recognize that he was way too radical, right? And he is actually assassinated. His last words are supposedly, God, don't let me die. I have so much left to do. And then God let him die. Yep, he is killed. A lot of people really thought that he might have been a contender for FDR. FDR was pretty terrified of him. So what you can see is really what these people are saying is that the government should be guaranteeing an income. That was kind of where they really thought the government should be playing into this. The last group is the New Deal was just right. So you can put this in the middle of your line there. And this is the New Deal Coalition. And the New Deal Coalition really believed that what Roosevelt was doing was a balance of these two extremes, of unregulated capitalism and overregulated socialism, right? The two sides of those coins, what the conservatives wanted and what the liberals wanted. They believed it was a good balance. Part of this is because labor is supporting FDR, and this is also because FDR is supporting labor, which was a big deal. So this coalition forms. It is a diverse group who support the Democratic Party, people who normally would not have come together, and people who did not actually always support the Democratic Party. So we have Southern whites, we have city dwellers, people from cities, mostly lower classes, African Americans, unions, laborers. These are people who had supported the Republican Party up until this point. Remember, the Republican Party was the party of Abraham Lincoln, so that attracted African Americans to it. It was the party that supported the labor unions. Think like Theodore Roosevelt, right? But this changes the Democratic Party pretty much permanently. If you think about, especially for like African Americans, for example, before the New Deal Coalition, most African Americans supported Republican. Today, most support Democrats, if you look at the policies of it. That changed with the New Deal. So this was a big deal, right? So as FDR is looking at how he's going to respond to these critics, he does a couple things. So first of all, he comes up with new alternatives for programs that maybe didn't work. The two that had the most controversy were the AAA and the NRA. So you might remember that the AAA was one that paid farmers to destroy crops and plow up land, okay? That was declared unconstitutional. It said you can't pay people for that. So the new Agricultural Adjustment Administration is more of a support, what we call a price support. So they don't destroy crops. Instead, you take your crops and you put them in storage, right? So what that's going to do is it's still going to drive up the price of crops, all right? It also will loan farmers money until those prices go up so that farmers will be able to continue their livelihood. They don't have to lose their farms. The idea being is once prices go back up, you can sell the crops you put in storage, pay all your debts off, right? And try to kind of work through that. The second one that's declared unconstitutional is the NRA. And the reason that this one was declared unconstitutional is because of the freezes it set, saying you can't do that. You can't put freezes on things. That's not part of our Constitution. You can't do that. It's too much government regulation. So the NRA is replaced with the National Labor Relations Board and the Federal Labor Standardization. So these are ones that support labor, right? Remember, FDR is the first president to support labor unions. That's what those two things, the NLRB and the FLSA, both go to support labor. So this is kind of goes back to when we talked about how Roosevelt likes to experiment. So try something. If it doesn't work, try something else. This is exactly what that is, right? So he's trying other things. The other thing that he does is probably one of the most controversial things that he does. And this is after the NRA and the AAA are declared unconstitutional. That basically the reason is that they use more power than was allowed by the executive branch. Roosevelt gets on the radio, right? And so he'd been doing these fireside chats throughout his entire administration. It's 1937. It's just after his second election. He's just been reelected. And he says, we've got these Supreme Court judges, right? They can stay on the bench their entire lives. That doesn't seem fair, right? Because, you get old, you get a little senile, maybe you're not making the best decisions anymore. I think we should change the Constitution. So instead of being lifetime, they should retire at 70. We should force them to retire. Also, 9 justices, that's just not enough, right? We're going to increase the size of the courts. This is called court packing. Now, here's the deal. Supreme Court was almost all Republican, almost all conservative. They were the ones blocking FDR's deal. How do you think it looks when FDR says, we're going to add all these new justices, and I get to appoint them, right? Yeah, you just want to put more Democrats on the Supreme Court, man. You just don't want them to block your deals anymore. That's not cool. So a lot of people had controversy with this. You can see this with this political cartoon here. I don't like the decisions. From now on, you're going to have to work with someone who can see things my way, right? So I don't like what you're doing, so I'm going to put people in there who can do what I want to do. This had a lot of controversy, as you can imagine it would. And really, after the first 100 days, people kind of saw that FDR was taking a little turn for the worse. There was a little bit of a issue with maybe a lot of these programs not working. Are we doing too much? And so he's not as supported during the second New Deal as he's going to be. And he doesn't really work with a lot of the critics. He doesn't really do a lot with them. He just kind of ignores them, right? So that's going to be a major issue as well. So he doesn't play well with others, right? So the last thing I want to do is talk really quickly about how the New Deal affected minority groups, okay? So we're going to talk about 3 main minority groups: women, African Americans, and Native Americans, okay? So first, let's start with women. So women had been changing a lot in the 20th century, from the beginning of the 20th century through the 1920s, the age of the flapper and that sort of thing, and World War I with them being able to go to work. So women are really starting to take on new roles during the 1930s. Well, first of all, FDR shows his support of women by appointing Frances Perkins as the Secretary of Labor in his cabinet. She is the first woman to ever be appointed to a cabinet position, so that's a big deal. Now, in 1936, 82% of Americans believe that a woman shouldn't work if her husband has a job. What this means is if the husband had a place to go every day, the woman's role is to stay home and take care of the kids. Now, if he couldn't find a job that she could, then she could go to work, help support the family until he found another job, right? Because it was the man's role. Now, think about where America is at this point. We are like suffering. It would be really nice to have 2 incomes in a family when you're not making a lot of money. But people were still really not into that. This is almost 10 years into the Depression, and people are still thinking this. So FDR didn't do a whole lot to support the traditional roles of women working. It wasn't, the New Deal didn't really support a lot of women. It supported single women, it supported young women, but it didn't really support married women. And it didn't really change the views of women in the way that they should work. However, by 1940, we still have more women working outside the home than we ever had before. Approximately 15% of women are working outside the home. So you can see the change is starting to take place. Part of that comes from Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt did a lot of the groundwork for FDR. Obviously, he, with his disability, was not able to get out there and do things. So Eleanor kind of reported back to him, right? She was kind of like his man in the field. And she kind of became an example to a lot of women on how they could lead the way. So that became a really important part of the Great Depression, is getting women to kind of lead the way with women like Frances Perkins and Eleanor Roosevelt. Next, we have African Americans. So African Americans, as you can imagine, are already suffering in our country, right? But the New Deal affects African Americans pretty hard because African Americans are not the top choice when people are hiring. If their option is to hire a white man or a black man, a lot of them are going to hire white men. And so African Americans are starting to suffer. And they really look to FDR as an inspiration for them. The first thing that happens is FDR appoints what's known as the Black Cabinet. So these are a group of advisors who are mostly African American, including this woman, Mary Bethune, who really kind of were there to help FDR know what to do for minorities, right? This is not an official cabinet. This was just kind of like the brain trust, a group of advisors that just kind of hung out with FDR and let him know what needed to be done. Mary actually said that this is the biggest step for African Americans in our country's history, the New Deal was. So it was a pretty big deal, pretty big influence. There's another instance during this time period where mostly Eleanor Roosevelt shows her support for African Americans. There's a very famous musician at the time, a woman named Marian Anderson. She was an opera singer, and she was supposed to sing for the Daughters of the American Revolution. They rejected her because she was black. They wouldn't let her sing. The DAR, the Daughters of the American Revolution, is one of the most prestigious organizations for women. Eleanor Roosevelt was actually a member. When they refused to let Marian Anderson sing, Eleanor resigned her membership, which was a blow to the DAR because she's the first lady, and then organized a free concert on the Lincoln Memorial for Marian Anderson for all of Washington, D.C., and this was really symbolic of the steps being made towards African Americans in that time. The problem is that things like the Black Cabinet and Marian Anderson's concert were very symbolic, but they didn't really do a whole lot, right? And in fact, when you look at what FDR was doing, they were not as great. So his record on civil rights really came to working with Congress. He was really afraid that if he tried to push civil rights, which he believed in, but he believed he would isolate the Southern Democrats and they would not pass anything. So he compromised. He said, well, I'm not going to push civil rights if you'll help me pass my laws, right? Now, remember, he's a Democrat, but it's Southern Democrats that he's worried about, okay? So there's no federal anti-lynching laws passed. Lynching is still a major problem. It's still going on. There's no end to the poll tax. So this is the tax where you have to pay if you want to go vote. And a lot of African Americans could not afford this. So this was like a big disenfranchisement for them. He also, there wasn't a lot of equality in New Deal programs. There was still segregation and discrimination in a lot of these New Deal programs. And that, said a lot to African Americans. But he was still an inspiration of hope for them. There's a lot of support for FDR from the African American community. So this quote here just says, Roosevelt touched the temper of the black community. You do not look upon him as being white, black, blue, or green. He was President Roosevelt. It's just who he was, right? And so this is part of that New Deal coalition where African Americans are starting to shift their allegiance from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party because of the hope that is inspired by Franklin Roosevelt. And it's a really big deal. It changes the political parties forever, right? The last group that I want to look at are Native Americans, okay? So Native Americans are probably some of the most impoverished people in our country, and they're still suffering from the things that we talked about way with the groups of the West stuff, okay? So President Roosevelt appoints a guy named John Collier to be Commissioner of Indian Affairs. This is a post that goes back to the 1880s. Usually it was a pretty corrupt post, but much as with the rest of the country, Roosevelt's trying to look at how he can improve lives of Native Americans as well. So something is passed which becomes nicknamed the Indian New Deal. It's really just a part of the New Deal, right? But basically, this provides economic assistance to Native Americans. They had not gotten a lot of support from the government because they lived in tribal lands, right? So they weren't really the government's problem. FDR says, of course they are. They live in our country. They should be our problem. So it provides economic assistance for them. It also allows them to have greater control over the reservations that they live on, over their own affairs. They can establish their own kind of government and economic control. They can make decisions separate from the federal government. So, like, for example, state of North Carolina, it's illegal to have a casino in the state, except in Cherokee, which is run by the Cherokee tribe, right? So they're allowed to have kind of their own little economic structure. It does reverse a lot of the old policies, such as the Dawes Act, which split up Native American land. So that's a really big deal, is reversing all of those very outdated policies from the end of the Civil War, right? But probably the most important thing is the Indian Reorganization Act. So the amount of Native American land was cut in half from 1888 to 1936. So the acreage was still being taken away. White people were still taking Native American land in the 20th century, okay? So the Indian Reorganization Act restores tribal control over a lot of the lands that had been taken from Native Americans. And this allows, again, more control, both cultural, economic, political, all these reforms for Native Americans. They can start, building their own schools and teaching their own history and their own culture. And this is a really big deal because this has not been allowed in the United States. So this is allowing Native Americans to kind of have their own control over what happens to them. The effect is not immediate, but we do see some progress in this. However, Native Americans today still make up the largest percentage of poverty in our country. If you're looking at the percentage of Native American groups and the percentage of poverty, almost all Native Americans live in poverty. So there's still a long way to go in terms of Native Americans. But the New Deal did make a big step in trying to help them out. So this kind of wraps up looking at the New Deal here. So I hope that you can see that whole Goldilocks where this is too much, this is too little, but this is just right. So you see those different groups of people who believe those different things, how the New Deal affected women, African Americans, other minorities, and I will see you in class to wrap up talking about it. Bye-bye, guys.